The sound of metal collapsing echoed through the Detroit factory like a gunshot while sparks burst across the dark assembly floor and every engineer inside froze in stunned silence. Smoke poured from the prototype engine sitting at the center of Hawthorne Motors' testing platform. Warning alarms screamed through the building. $1 million equipment flashed red. And standing behind the glass observation wall, CEO Charlotte Hawthorne slowly removed her glasses as another expert quietly whispered the words she had already heard too many times. "It's finished." Rain hammered the factory roof overhead while investors watched nervously from upstairs offices. Reporters waited outside for updates about the company's failing electric truck engine, the one Charlotte had spent 3 years and nearly everything she owned trying to build. If this engine failed publicly, Hawthorne Motors would collapse. Thousands of workers would lose jobs. And Charlotte would become another headline about a woman CEO who couldn't handle pressure. Have you ever carried the weight of so many people's futures that failure stopped feeling personal and started feeling terrifying? "Shut it down," one senior engineer muttered. Another shook his head. "The thermal damage is irreversible." Charlotte stared silently at the smoking engine while exhaustion hollowed her face. She hadn't slept properly in days. Investors were already threatening lawsuits. Competitors circled like wolves waiting for bankruptcy. Then a quiet voice spoke from behind the maintenance crew. "No," the man said softly. "It isn't finished." Nobody even looked at him at first. Because he was just the night janitor. Eli Brooks stood near the tool cabinets wearing grease-stained work clothes and carrying a mop bucket beside him. 38 years old, exhausted eyes. Wedding ring still on his finger even though his wife passed away 2 years earlier from cancer. Most employees barely noticed him. But Charlotte did now. One engineer scoffed openly. What exactly would a janitor know about thermal systems? Eli hesitated briefly before stepping closer toward the damaged engine. "The coolant timing is delayed by 2.3 seconds after pressure spike," he said carefully. "That's why the heat keeps feeding back into the core." Silence hit the factory floor instantly. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. "That's impossible," another snapped. Eli pointed toward the burned valve housing. "No, the sensor calibration's wrong." He swallowed. "You're trying to fix overheating instead of fixing what's causing it." Charlotte narrowed her eyes carefully. "How would you know that?" Eli looked uncomfortable suddenly. "Because some people spend years hiding intelligence after life forces them into survival instead of opportunity. I used to design diesel systems," he admitted quietly. The room went still. "What happened?" Charlotte asked. A faint sadness crossed his face. "Life. What would you do if the person everyone ignored suddenly became the only one who understood the problem?" 2 hours later, the factory remained alive with tension while Eli worked alone beside the dismantled engine under harsh fluorescent lights. Rain streaked the high factory windows. Grease covered his hands. Nearby engineers watched skeptically like men waiting for failure they could mock later. Charlotte stood silently beside him. "You really think this can work?" she asked. Eli tightened a bolt carefully. "My daughter needs asthma medication." His voice stayed calm. "I can't afford to lie." The honesty hit harder than confidence ever could. Charlotte studied him quietly. "You have a daughter." 12. A faint smile touched his tired face. "Mia." He paused briefly. "She still thinks I can fix anything." Something painful moved through Charlotte's chest at those words. Because she hadn't spoken to her own father in 6 years. Success destroyed that relationship piece by piece until pride became louder than love. Meanwhile Eli kept working patiently beneath the engine lights. Not for recognition, for survival, for his little girl waiting at home. Hours passed. Finally, Eli wiped grease from his forehead before looking toward Charlotte. "Try it now," one engineer muttered under his breath. "This is ridiculous." Charlotte ignored him. The factory held its breath as the ignition system powered on. A low mechanical hum filled the room. Then stronger, smoother, cleaner. The prototype engine roared to life perfectly for the first time in 7 months. Silence exploded across the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the machines seemed stunned. Then Charlotte laughed. Not polished corporate laughter. Real laughter bursting unexpectedly through exhaustion and disbelief. Several engineers stared at Eli like they were seeing him for the first time. But Eli only looked relieved. Because all he could think about was Mia's inhaler prescription sitting unpaid inside his kitchen drawer. Have you ever solved someone else's impossible problem while secretly drowning in your own? Later that night, Charlotte drove through a rough Detroit neighborhood following the address from Eli's employee records. She didn't fully understand why. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe loneliness. When she reached the apartment building, she saw Eli through a small kitchen window helping his daughter with homework beneath dim yellow lights. Mia suddenly laughed loudly at something he said. And Eli laughed too, tired, broken, but genuine. Charlotte remained frozen inside her car watching them. Because despite her billions, despite magazine covers and private jets, nobody waited for her like that at home. Upstairs, Eli noticed Mia struggling with math frustration. "I'm stupid," the girl whispered sadly. Eli immediately knelt beside her. "Hey," his voice softened firmly. "Broken things can still work beautifully if people stop giving up on them too early." Charlotte heard the sentence faintly through the cracked kitchen window. And suddenly tears filled her eyes unexpectedly. Because for the first time in years, she realized the words weren't only about engines. They were about people, about grief, about exhausted fathers and lonely CEOs and wounded hearts pretending they were beyond repair. Outside, rain slowly stopped over Detroit while factory smoke drifted into the dark sky. And sitting silently in her luxury car beneath that tiny apartment window glowing with warmth, Charlotte Hawthorne finally understood something life-changing. The world often overlooks the people carrying the deepest wisdom because pain rarely arrives dressed in expensive clothes. 3 months later, cameras flashed wildly outside Hawthorne Motors headquarters while reporters crowded behind steel barricades shouting questions into the cold Detroit wind. Financial analysts called it impossible. The engine worked. Not only worked, it outperformed every competitor in the market. Stock prices exploded overnight. Investors returned. And the same experts who once called the project dead, now praised Charlotte Hawthorne as a visionary genius on national television. But inside the executive conference room high above the city, Charlotte barely listened to any of it. Because across the room sat Eli Brooks wearing an uncomfortable suit he clearly hated, nervously adjusting the tie Mia helped him pick out that morning. Have you ever watched someone completely unprepared for success handle it with more humility than people born into privilege? The board chairman smiled proudly. "Mr. Brooks, your engine modifications saved this company." Eli shifted awkwardly. "It wasn't just me, but it was your insight," another executive insisted. "We'd like to officially offer you the position of senior systems engineer." Silence filled the room. Charlotte noticed Eli's hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, from disbelief. Because grief changes the way people view good fortune. After enough loss, happiness begins feeling temporary, almost suspicious. Finally Eli spoke softly. "I never finished college." The executives exchanged uncertain looks. But Charlotte answered before anyone else could. "You finished something harder." Her voice remained calm. "You survived." Eli lowered his eyes immediately. Because no one had spoken to him with that kind of understanding since his wife Rachel died. Later that evening, snow drifted softly across downtown Detroit while Eli walked Charlotte through the old factory testing floor now buzzing with celebration. Workers laughed near food tables. Music echoed through the building. But Eli remained strangely quiet. Charlotte noticed. "You should be proud tonight." "I'm trying to remember how." The honesty stopped her cold. He looked toward the prototype engine standing beneath bright lights. "When Rachel got sick, I sold everything chasing treatments." His voice roughened slightly. "House, savings, future." He swallowed hard. "After she died, surviving became automatic." A faint broken laugh escaped him. "I forgot people could still believe in me." Charlotte stared at him silently. Because she understood loneliness too well. Not the kind caused by isolation. The kind created by carrying pressure so long that vulnerability starts feeling dangerous. What would you do if someone saw the exhausted version of you, and stayed anyway? At that exact moment, small footsteps echoed through the factory. "Dad." Mia ran across the floor wearing a winter coat too big for her tiny frame before launching into Eli's arms. "You missed the cake cutting," she complained dramatically. Eli laughed softly while holding her tightly. "Tragic. I'll never recover." Charlotte watched them quietly. Then Mia noticed her standing nearby. "Miss Hawthorne," she said seriously, "Dad cried in the car after your speech." Eli nearly choked. "Mia, what?" the girl asked innocently. You did. Charlotte smiled despite herself. Mia studied her carefully before asking, do rich people cry a lot? The question hung in the air softly. Charlotte looked toward the factory windows where snowflakes drifted beneath orange streetlights. Yes, she answered quietly. Sometimes because they spent too much time pretending not to. Mia nodded thoughtfully like that answer made complete sense. Children always recognized emotional truths adults complicated. Later that night, after the celebration ended, Charlotte drove Eli and Mia home through silent snowy streets. Inside the car, Mia fell asleep against her father's shoulder clutching leftover cake in a napkin. Charlotte glanced toward them briefly at a red light. You know, she admitted softly, I used to think leadership meant never showing weakness. Eli looked out the window quietly. My wife used to say people trust honesty more than perfection. The sentence settled deeply inside her chest. Because for years Charlotte built walls around herself strong enough to impress investors, but too cold to let anybody truly close. When they arrived at the apartment building, Eli carefully carried Mia upstairs while Charlotte followed behind unexpectedly. The apartment looked different now. Still small, still imperfect, but warmer somehow, alive. Mia's science fair ribbon hung proudly near the refrigerator. New groceries filled the kitchen counters. Hope had slowly returned to rooms grief once emptied. Then Charlotte noticed something framed beside the family photographs. A picture of Rachel, and beneath it, handwritten words. Broken things are still worthy of love. Charlotte's throat tightened painfully, because suddenly she realized why Eli never became bitter despite everything life stole from him. Love remained bigger than his suffering. Even after death, even after failure, even after losing almost everything. Before leaving, Charlotte stood quietly near the apartment doorway. I spent most of my life trying to prove I was stronger than everyone around me, she admitted. Eli leaned gently against the wall. And now, snow fell softly outside while warm kitchen light wrapped around the tiny apartment. Charlotte smiled sadly. Now I think real strength might just be refusing to let pain turn you cruel. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mia sleepily wandered into the hallway rubbing her eyes. You staying for pancakes tomorrow? She asked Charlotte. The billionaire CEO blinked in surprise. Nobody had invited her somewhere simple in years. No business agenda, no networking, just pancakes. Charlotte looked at Eli uncertainly. He smiled faintly. We make terrible pancakes. Fair warning. And standing there between the exhausted single father, the sleepy little girl, and the apartment filled with scars life never fully erased, Charlotte Hawthorne finally understood something more valuable than success itself. Sometimes the people who repair broken machines also quietly repair broken hearts, simply by reminding the world that being human is never something to be ashamed of.